on the Saturday. So the world changed in 48 hours. But we have decided to stick with what were a set of very moderate political positionings, despite the fact that the world had changed. And we had, in fact, specifically ruled out large-scale structural change in the public service. The second reason we've chosen, though, to stick with the models as they are is that our previous experience through the 80s and the 90s has taught a number of people, including myself involved, particularly as a minister, that longer-term effective change is driven by people who know the business, who clearly understand the parameters they're working to, and have the tools they need to implement change. And that is why we're making chief executives of departments the fulcrum of change. This model, though, does require ministers and chief executives to clarify exactly what results they want. We are using the basic tools of ministerial and chief executive accountability, not new ones. So we spend a good deal of time ensuring that a discussion between the Prime Minister and ministers reflect exactly the expectations over the next 2 or 3 years, rather than getting distracted onto whether the All Blacks beat the Wallabies again. For the third time in his career, Robbie Deans is becoming a national hero in New Zealand. The process of, we believe strongly in alignment of expectations. So the process of making sure the Prime Minister and ministers are clear about their expectations and performance is something we put a good deal of time into, and reinforcement. It is a process that takes time to build momentum. A culture of caution and risk management in our public sector has become deeply embedded in the last 10 years. So we have to keep demonstrating political support for change and reinforcing the mandate that chief executives can use tools and make change without fear of political consequences. And I think they're just starting to believe us after 2 years. We reinforce this with, again, simple tool, and that is regular oversight of our largest entities, the 10 different public entities that make up 80% of government expenditure. It's required a lot of work using these very basic tools simply to slow down the growth in government spending. Now, there are, of course, a number of challenges with this, and for experienced civil servants, they will all be predictable. The first is that if you don't have early momentum, everyone in the public sector hopes the rules will change. And in particular, that politicians don't actually mean what they're saying, because there's some evidence that happens sometimes. And that politicians won't stick to self-imposed spending constraints. Some, I think, in our public service are still trying to wait it out. However, that's not going to work. In the first place, hope is not a strategy for a professional civil servant. It's been tried often, and occasionally it's worked, but in the next few years it's not going to work, because the events, the recession, the events around the world, the difficulties of public finance are not going to change. Hoping they will won't change them. And in New Zealand, at least, there is strong demand from the public to see the civil service doing what they have had to do themselves, and that is be careful with their spending and make sure they have clear priorities in their businesses or in their households. So there's strong and broad political support. So the scare stories aren't going to work and haven't so far. Secondly, in a devolved system such as we have, it takes time and effort to get the balance between the collective and individual interests among ministers. I've learnt the hard way over a long period of time, the public service will not do something if ministers are ambivalent about it getting done. And even if one wants to do it, if the others aren't very clear, then that's another way out. So we spend a great deal of time getting the collective interests of ministers all aligned, and that can be a bit of a challenge in a centre-right government where ministers tend to come from self-employed and business backgrounds. In our system, they have impressive degrees of freedom to do or not to do things. but I have to say it is a very worthwhile effort to maintain the political cohesion among that group that then leads to clear messages to a public service. Probably a third and most important challenge, though, is whether our public management system, I suspect in Australia as well as New Zealand, permits or encourages the kinds of solutions that are now required. And the presentation we've just seen from Helen tells us a lot about the nature of the solutions that we'll be looking to over in the next few years. In the last 20 years, there have been many attempts at joined up or collaborative government. Solutions such as shared services, joint procurement, joint decision making across a sector don't fit naturally at all into the parliamentary appropriation process in the first place, or secondly into the traditional structure of this public service, which has not altered in terms of its hierarchical accountability for many years. Most of these attempts in collaborative government, at least in New Zealand, have failed, ultimately, because the processes of joining up are actually very inefficient. They take enormous time and effort, and having done that, a large committee collaborating doesn't make for accountability. In the end, it wears people out and they go back to their corners generally. Not always, but usually. So it's a challenge for a public service to develop strong internal governance to run joint processes. And in New Zealand, we're expecting them to do that without strong direction from a highly centralised process. So what we have done about that is to encourage this within a public service that is struggling with the concept, is we've supported a handful of collective processes such as joint procurement and beginning soon administrative and support services benchmarking, shared services in the health sector, so focused on the simpler stuff that most people are doing around administrative change, because we're going down a path of what I might call organic change, and that is tasks that can be readily understood, where they learn how to work together better and seriously, not just talk about it. We've also set up an internal infrastructure unit to create better capital management. So in each of these examples, our chief executives have the choice of picking up those tools or not. They are not compelled. Progress has been slow to start with, but momentum is now picking up, because chief executives understand that when they do a simple exercise like forecast their costs against their revenues, there's a big gap and it's negative. We use a very straightforward framework for the case for change. Their revenue is flat, their costs are rising, and over the next 4 years, that gap will grow every month that they sit on their hands. That is starting to have some impact. The voluntary participation in these collective initiatives keeps a very healthy tension on central agencies and other policy entrepreneurs with a great idea to show that there is value for the time and effort for public sector managers to spend collaborating. Essentially, if they're not willing to show up and sit through long, boring meetings with 17 people with an opinion, then they shouldn't have to. They've got to find another way, and if they want to use Twitter, well, they can. But we believe that voluntary participation is critical to ensuring you're making genuine progress rather than just ticking the box on reporting to the Minister. However, the governance of back office processes is just a first step, and I have to say we haven't quite managed it yet, but we will get there. The next step, of course, is to fulfil the theory of our own public management system by doing what we thought we were going to do 20 years ago but haven't done, and that is determine outcomes we want in the wider community and structure accountability and governance in the public sector around those outcomes. That approach, of course, conflicts to a significant extent with our traditional models of parliamentary accountability. However, parliamentary accountability accounts for the money, but it has singularly failed over the last 20 years to account for results. And in New Zealand, we've been through a long process of, for instance, trying to upgrade the scrutiny of our select committees. But going along as a minister, I'd have to say it's not a fearsome forum, and that's largely because of the huge information imbalance between opposition MPs and ministers. So we have to resolve that tension between accountability for results and accountability for the money. And I'll just give you an example. The criminal justice system. We are doing some similar work that has been done, I think, in Victoria here, in trying to make our criminal justice system more affordable. New Zealand has one of the highest imprisonment rates in the world, and locking people up is very expensive. So at a time when funding is tight, we have to find ways to foot the bill for tougher sentences for serious criminals, which the public is demanding. One response, of course, is to reduce offending. Seems obvious. But also prosecution and imprisonment rates for less serious offenders. So starting about four years ago, justice sector agencies in New Zealand began to work together to understand better what happens in the justice pipeline, who gets arrested and why, how they move through the courts and prisons, courts and police, how they end up in prison, and what does that all cost. This has generated at least some initial operational solutions for a more effective and, in my view, a more just and humane system. We can get some benefits within the current structure, but you can imagine the problem because you live in this world. We have a series of agencies with their own statutory powers, the police different from the courts, different from corrections, different from probation, and then an NGO sector that sits outside that. Each of these organisations, because they wear uniforms, have strong cultures, and those cultures tend to be strongly hierarchical and fairly rigid. So we have a big challenge. Now that we've got a rough idea of the pipeline, really the fundamental issue is not to recite again the appalling statistics about which groups are more likely to end up in prison, which has been the stuff of public policy in this area for too long. We have to develop a governance regime that is going to allow us to drive the outcomes that we want, such as reduced prison numbers. And for the public service, that is much more difficult, actually, than the policy analysis of the pipeline, because we're asking them to fundamentally alter their relationships of power and funding and authority. And they will only do that if we can develop a strong enough constituency in the public who say, we want less people in prison, we want less youth offending, so that the minister has because politicians are simple people, we need very simple processes, where the minister can say, my outcome the Prime Minister has given me is reduced prison numbers, and I know who is responsible to me for achieving that. We do not have that structure. At the moment, that's sort of an amalgam of a number of chief executives, police commissioners, all trying to work their way in a similar direction. They've probably got up to the collaboration stage, which means they've all introduced themselves to each other. But this is a